and welcome to Voices of Truth One-on-One with Hawaii's Future, brought to you by the Kiwani Foundation. I'm Ehuke Kahu Cardwell, and here we are today on the island of Oahu, and it seems like we're on top of the world. And wait until you see the guest we have for you today on the show. Let's go on over here and meet him. Clay, aloha.
Aloha, how you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Nice
Clay
to meet you too.
Trauernicht. Did I say your name right?
You got it.
We're going to talk about fires today. You are somebody who would be described as a fire scientist, yeah?
Yeah, you could call me that.
You're an expert on fires, when they occur, how they occur, the
Right.
likelihood that they might occur, stuff
Right.
like that.
Exactly, yeah.
But that's kind of, people probably are going, well, wait a minute, what are they doing in Hawaii then? Because most people think of Hawaii as tropical islands. They get a ton of rain and there's no fires.
Yeah, I think you could say that was a pretty generalized perception, obviously until the Maui fires this past year. And
Until Lahaina burned down.
Until Lahaina and Kula and big fires on the Big Island the same day. And, unfortunately it took something like that to put us on the map as far as fire is concerned.
Yeah. Clay, correct me if I'm wrong, but the truth is Hawaii actually does have and has had a tremendous number of fires throughout the years, yes?
Yeah, we have been able to me and some colleagues have been able to put that history together and really look at not only the quantity, but just how it's changed over the past 120 years or so. And it turns out fires are extremely frequent. We get big ones on almost all the islands each year. And when you look at it sort of proportional to the land area that we have to burn, we stack up right alongside the Western U.S.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, so we're unlike the Western U.S. where there's a whole lot of land you can run to or move to. These are islands.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's only so many places you can go.
Totally, and so a lot of the things that we value and the things that we want to protect are just all kind of stacked on top of each other, from our communities and neighborhoods to the forests and reefs. All these things are really kind of in close proximity, so the impacts can be sort of more concentrated as well. We don't think of this place as being highly flammable. You tend to associate fires with the Western U.S., for example, and it's really been a recent thing as well. So it's kind of within the past few decades is when we've seen a lot of this fire activity increase. And for us, it's kind of a combination of the vegetation, how that's changed around our communities, as well as what we're doing on the landscape around our communities. So it's really, I would say something new and something we don't typically associate with as you said earlier, tropical environments.
Yeah, but really, when you stop and think about it, all islands, I think all over the world, have a windward side and a leeward side to them, yeah?
Yeah, as long as you have enough of an elevation change, you're gonna get leeward and windward effects that we see in Hawaii. And so we're all quite familiar when you go out to the leeward sides, the west sides of our islands, that they tend to be pretty dry, pretty persistently dry throughout the year.
Yeah, so the windward sides, those are the ones that are wet, tropical, moist,
Yeah.
and have a lower fire risk.
Typically. But even on the windward sides, we can get dry conditions, right? So we know the kind of summer, winter rainfall patterns that we get, but we also get drought on the windward sides. And so we've seen pretty large fires, even like Hamakua Coast.
Wow.
Even on the windward side of Oahu, we've seen fires. So it really just depends on those longer term patterns of rainfall, right? When it's drying out, how much rainfall we've already gotten before that, right? Which actually causes all these grasses that we're worried about to grow.
Mm-hmm. But the leeward side, they're totally dried out. They might get a little rain throughout the year, but most of the time it's more like a desert condition, yeah?
Not quite desert. So one of the things with fires, you need enough rainfall for plants to grow. Because if there's nothing out there, we don't really get wildfires in deserts.
There's nothing to burn.
There's nothing to burn, exactly. Yeah. So it turns out that all of our leeward areas get adequate rainfall to support grasses and shrubs, and then most summer times they get crispy and dry, and that's when fire risk tends to be high.
Clay, how long ago actually was it that these fire risks started to heighten here in Hawaii?
Yeah, it's actually a recent phenomenon, relatively speaking, and the big change has to do with how we're caring for or not taking care of the lands around our communities. So as opposed to what we see a lot of places in the continental US, where people are building into these fire-adapted, fire-prone ecosystems, where fire is a natural part of those ecosystems. For us, it's this combination of invasive grasses, but really what the culprit is the lack of land use, right? So the shift from plantation agriculture, large-scale grazing within the past, say, 50 years or so. As those industries have declined and the footprint of active management has declined, you get this filling in of all those spaces with these non-native grasses and shrubs, and fire risk increases around our communities. And that's the pattern pretty much statewide. And so it's really tied to you know, how we value and what we do with the landscape.
Clay, we're standing here for a reason, yes?
Yeah, I invited you guys up here because it gives us a pretty good view of sort of the foreground here, some of the typical fuels and vegetation that causes fire risk, contributes to fire risk, and also the kind of picture of the consequences of repeated fires, which you can see across the valley here.
So this vegetation, I mean, right in front of us here, this looks nice and green and tropical.
Right,
And
yeah.
yet you're saying that this is actually the stuff that dries out?
Yeah.
And is the fire hazard?
Yeah, guinea grass. This is guinea grass in the front, halicua in the back, and this mix of grasses and shrubs, especially halicua, and this grass is prevalent all over Oahu in particular. When it dries out, it just provides an enormous amount of fuel for fires to burn. And so it looks nice and green right now, but give it a month or two without rain, it'll get nice yellow and crispy. And this really makes us sensitive to these rainfall cycles. So when we get heavy rains like we've seen recently, you get a ton of fuels building up on the landscape, and then they cure when we come into summer typically, and creating this high risk. And then you'll see halicua is often mixed in this, and it has all these seed pods that they shower embers out in front of the fire, so that contributes to fires actually jumping over fire breaks, and those ember showers become really dangerous when we're talking about the built environment, because it's the leading cause of home ignitions.
So Clay, wait a second. What you're really talking about here are time bombs, yes?
Yeah.
These are time bombs.
Essentially, it's this idea of when we don't do work, right? We don't care for landscape, we kind of let these places go. This is the consequence. You get these unmanaged fuels, and it creates incredibly high fire risk at specific times of the year. And I would say predominantly our concern with fire has also been on the watershed forests, and that's kind of why I brought you guys here, because we see this perfect intersection of this grassland on the lower slopes here of this ridge.
Right over here.
Right across, that's Wahila Ridge. And that whole lower slope has burned about 4 times, I'd say, in the past 10 years or so.
Wow. So Clay, when we're looking at this here, what we see is the nice light green color.
Yep.
Then there's that vertical line.
Yep.
And then there's the dark green color.
Exactly.
So are you saying that this is, the light green is where the fire burned up to and it stopped at that line?
Exactly. And
Really?
so each successful fires start really easily. When that gets nice and dry and crispy, the fires
Because
start
of stuff
readily.
like this?
It's guinea grass. So the same, that whole light green vegetation over there is exactly what we're looking at right in front of us. That carries the fire up to that forest line, and then the fire sort of trickles in and kind of burns into that forest line. You can see some of the dead trees that have died in the last fire up along that hillside. And then what happens is the grasses kind of move into the forest, and it primes it for the next fire. So each successive fire, you're seeing that forest line erode further and further up the mountain.
Wow, that's amazing, because, you know, I mean, to the uneducated eye, somebody who wasn't standing here listening to you right now, describe this. You stand here and you look at it and you go, wow, this is a tropical paradise.
Right.
It's so beautiful, it's so green.
Right.
And yet it's burned how many times lately?
This is the 4th fire. So the last fire, I think, was 2020. It was during COVID. So yeah, if you're not paying attention and you're not familiar with these places, you wouldn't really understand how frequent and how often this is occurring.
But here's the other thing. Down in this valley are all these buildings, all these homes,
Exactly,
residences, office buildings. There's University of Hawaii Manoa campus.
Yeah.
And so when that fire goes, that gives off embers that go in the wind. All this stuff is at risk.
Yeah, so we're seeing kind of the other sides. We talked about the forests and those impacts, but the big risk that I think most of our emergency response agencies are rightly concerned with is the danger it poses to the homeowners and other infrastructure, right? And so that each of those fires burnt right up to the edge of those homes. You can see at the bottom of that slope.
Yeah, look how close it came.
Right up to the edge. And so when we kind of leave fuels like this, and you're sort of thinking, it's nice and green, there's nothing to worry about, but that sets us up for these times when those conditions line up. So you get, short to long-term drought, high winds, and an ignition source, and you're off to the races, as they say. And then this terrain is incredibly difficult to suppress fires in. So firefighters are relying usually on helicopter support, and they're not really able to, or willing, I think, to put people in danger's way and harm's way to go up into that terrain to fight the fire. So for example, with this, last time that this burned, you basically had the Honolulu Fire Department set up between the homes. Fortunately, they were able to get between the homes and that slope and sort of protecting the homes as the fire approached.
Man, but that sounds really dangerous.
It can be, right? High wind conditions, incredibly low humidity. It can be really dangerous. And as we saw again with Lahaina and Kula, you get into those kinds of wind conditions, there's not a lot that can stop these fires. You can't use helicopters, which we rely on heavily. And that's when we really see that there's this need to have these longer term, fire breaks, fuels mitigation projects to call it. But it's basically where you're sort of deciding, we're gonna knock down the fuels here, we're gonna alter it in some way to make it less likely to burn. And those are long-term projects. It's long-term investment in land management in the interest of public safety.
Wow.
Yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind is it's work. It takes a lot of work to do this stuff, a lot of investment in land management, in land care.
Clay, now we've come up to the top of the mountain here because you promised me there is going to be a really nice view up here, yes?
Well, I haven't been here in a while, but from what I recall, yeah.
All right, let's go over and take a look at it and see if you can keep your promises here.
Yeah.
But, oh wow, it didn't take long. Look at that.
Right here.
Wow.
So yeah, another view of the ridge we were talking about earlier, and then of course Diamond Head, which has also burned quite a few number of times.
Diamond Head
has had fires, and a lot of the communities over there are pretty worried about fires coming into their backyards, both the Kahala side as well as the Kaimuki side. With colleagues, we've done a lot of fire mapping, so we actually maintain fire history. So we not only do we collect these data that the fire response agencies are collecting, but we also map fires from satellite. So that's one way to just look at the history, where have they occurred in the past. We also map fuels. We map the vegetation, develop new ways that we can have really up-to-date, be able to look at the condition of fuels up-to-date, almost real-time kind of stuff, so that we can anticipate, for example, in central Maui, when all of that central Maui sugarcane plantation went out of production, how does the vegetation that moves into that place change fire risk for the folks around Kihei and Kahului?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, it's one thing to have all this data and all these measurements, but it's something entirely to put all that stuff together so it actually begins to mean something, yes?
Yes.
And that's what you guys did, yeah?
Yeah, well, we really looked at these changes, the extent of fire, which I think was shocking to all of us that were looking at it. And you got to tell a story with it. You have to communicate not just how scary things are and how real the risk is, but what are the actions that we can take to fix it. And all of these things that people worry about, especially related to climate change and weather events, so tsunamis and typhoons or hurricanes. I mean, fire is one of these things that we can actually do some pretty clear steps to mitigate the risk. So it's not out of our hands. In fact, a lot of the risk has been created by decisions that landowners have made over the years to continue or not continue using the land in certain ways.
So what you're saying, Clay, is this is not like a hurricane where we don't have any control of whether it's going to come our way or not.
Right.
These are things that human beings actually created, these situations.
Exactly.
That could have been prevented. It didn't have to be.
Exactly. That's, both bright side, but also one of the harder things to swallow, especially when we think about the devastation on Maui. you know, in my view, it was preventable. We really need to learn from that event in particular, but just learn from what these resources that myself and colleagues at Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, Division of Forestry and Wildlife have been sort of working on this. What are the things that we can do to create safer spaces for both the watershed forests that we want to protect, but also the neighborhoods that we want to protect.
How long did it take you guys to do all this research, all this homework, and put all these facts and figures and measurements together?
Yeah, it was really fortunate timing. When I started in 2013, colleagues at Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization had been working with the local county agencies primarily, but as well as forestry. They put together for the first time the statewide fire history.
First ever.
First time anyone had sort of put all
in 2013.
2013. And they just basically handed me this crazy spreadsheet. And they said, let's take a look, help us. We need to want to define, like, what's the scope of the problem. And so we started looking at frequency, how many ignitions and where are they happening. We started looking at the size, like how much area is burning. And most importantly, like where the fires are happening. And so that work kind of spun into all that narrative that I was describing. It's like, holy crap, we actually are experiencing quite extensive fires, especially when it's relative to our land size that I was explaining earlier. We were right alongside the western US, you know. Some of our worst fire years, we actually exceed, you know, the percentage of land area burns.
Worse than the fires in California.
Yeah,
and
like
stuff
we're
like that.
up to 1% or so by comparison. I think some of California's worst years was about, you know, 0.4% of the state land area.
It ain't just a number anymore. When the fire is approaching your backyard,
And
it becomes very real.
That's exactly right. When the fire's happening, well, two things to keep in mind. You get to see, okay, here's all the factors that are contributing to risk. So again, working with the firefighters to actually understand what are their limitations when a fire is happening, what would they like to have had in place. And that's when you also realize, probably as a homeowner, like, gee, it would be nice to have had a fire break up there, maybe having animals graze those fuels down. I wouldn't be so worried, and the firefighters would have a better chance at suppressing the fire. What we're learning from Lahaina in the aftermath, unfortunately, is all these things that we can do in the built environment. So what are the actions around my house that I can take? What are the materials that we need to be thinking about to make homes less likely to catch fire, right? So these are the kind of two dimensions we think about: built environment, the kind of fire environment, what's contributing to fires igniting and carrying across the landscape.
Okay, so you guys have been working on this for at least 10 years, yeah?
Oh yeah, longer. You know, we've had colleagues with Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization. That they are a nonprofit that's been around for I think close to 20 years now.
Wow.
And we're really started by folks in the fire suppression community, right? So folks at Division of Forestry and Wildlife, county fire departments who are like, we need to do more. Everything is on the shoulders of the firefighters still. Right now, you know, we see this horrific event happen in Maui, and all of us are just on pins and needles. Where's the next one going to be? We know the risk is high. I mean, I can start rolling out communities where we know, we understand.
You've got to memorize.
Yeah, we've been looking at maps for a long, long time. So we know where the risk is high, and yet we haven't, you know, there was no immediate increase in resources to suddenly deal with that risk. And so that's kind of where I think we are at now. What is it going to take to actually meaningfully reduce risk in and around our communities primarily, but that also confers benefits to the watershed, like all the forest that burns up in these successive fires.
Okay, Clay, so, you know, 10, 15 years ago when they first said here, and they dumped all these maps and facts and figures on the table in front of you, and you guys started to work with that stuff, you started to add more stuff, and then you began to put the picture together.
Yeah.
And I'm going to assume that as you begin to put the picture together, it's kind of like putting a jigsaw puzzle together on a table. The more pieces you fit together, you begin to see this picture.
Yeah.
And what was it like for you when the picture began to emerge of what really the risk was here? What was that like for you to see that and discover that?
Well, it was surprising. I didn't expect it to be as extensive, the fires to be as extensive as they are. You start looking at these historical changes, and really what it comes down to is land abandonment, agricultural abandonment. So we've seen about 60% declines, maybe more, in the actual footprint of grazing area, of plantation agriculture. And when you remove that land use off of the land, these grasses and shrubs fill in. And all of these grasses and shrubs have been introduced from other parts of the world.
Okay, so what you're saying, Clay, is that this was man-made.
Yes.
And the reason it was man-made was because grasses and vegetation that are not native to Hawaii
Yeah.
came here somehow.
Were brought intentionally.
They were brought in.
Yeah.
They were brought in. And what happened was, after Westerners came to Hawaii, they started to use some of the lands on each of the islands for propagation of things like sugarcane and pineapple and what have you.
Yeah, so it backs up all the way. So again,
It backs up to about what year?
well, contact, Western contact. If you want to bring it back that far, what we're talking about is how do we care for the lands around our communities? What are we using them for? What is the investment we make in taking care of these places that we supposedly that we love, right? But what are the resources available to do that? And so if you back all the way up to pre-contact times, right, you have these sophisticated agricultural systems, Hawaiis and local ia, like you have really sophisticated food production systems. And then Western contact comes, what you're doing is not just bringing in, all these white people, but you're bringing in a different economic system.
A foreign system.
A foreign system that looks at the land as a commodity, right?
Yeah,
so
it's
simply
it has not been adapted to what is actually
no,
here.
you think about how do you use these resources to make cash, essentially,
money.
right? And so that turns into privatization, and you get sort of the dismantling of those traditional systems of land use to produce agricultural commodities. So is it cattle, plantations, so sugarcane and pineapple. And I'm not trying to demonize cattle, for example, but it has to be understood that those practices dramatically altered the landscape, right? So, even before that, there's sandalwood harvesting, right? These practices resulted in really dramatic changes, deforestation, the spread of these grasses, right? So you have really, really big changes, both socially and ecologically. And then now what we're dealing with is the sort of post-plantation era. These companies that had invested in sort of large-scale land use, large-scale agriculture, sort of shift gears. Not sort of, they shift gears towards real estate. Well, they don't leave, they just say, actually, we can make more money developing a few blocks in downtown Honolulu or a coastal strip on West Maui. Mm-hmm. We'll make more money doing that than managing thousands and thousands of acres of pineapple or sugarcane. We can use reforestation, we can use the plants themselves to actually reduce the risk, reduce the extent and continuity of these grassy fuels. And so that's really where you start to move from, okay, here's this legacy of plantation agriculture that we have to deal with, and the shrinking footprint of active operations, right, both grazing and for plantations. What strategies do we have to reduce risk in those landscapes? Mm-hmm. Fuel breaks, right? That's kind of where you're just mowing and you're mowing and mowing and mowing because that grass grows every time you've got rainfall. You can do these grazing, right? So you can hit huge footprints, and a lot of ranchers, Maui and Big Island in particular, they know about this fire cycles. They're moving cattle around intentionally to knock down those fuels. Incredibly, incredibly valuable tool, not just the animals themselves, but the knowledge that those guys have in particular. And then the kind of ultimate would be put it back in agriculture, right? That's like the safest, when I use this analogy all the time, when, not that we want to go back to sugarcane, but we weren't worried about Lahaina burning down when it was all sugarcane around the town. We weren't worried about Lahaina burning down. The Hawaiians were never worried about Lahaina burning down when it was all
too wet.
It was wet, but they had groves of breadfruit that they're tending. They have all these plants and agricultural systems.
Really, this whole thing started, the risk really jumped when foreigners came in, guys came in from foreign lands to Hawaii.
Yeah.
They brought in a foreign system of, we'll call it land management or lack thereof.
Sure.
They grew crops, which they made money from for a time. Their intention was to use the land to make money.
Yeah.
And then when something shinier over there grabbed their attention, they said, well, we want to go over there and do that, which is like build real estate.
Right.
They ran away from or just left this area over here where they were growing crops, and that land was left to itself, and that's where the invasive plants and grasses took over.
Yeah.
And like on Maui, that's what was the source of the fire.
As tragic as Lahaina was, especially looking at the leaders in that community and seeing how seriously, not only how seriously do they have to take this given the impacts of it, but how they immediately connect it to the ways in which they're able to care for lands, and how it ties to the struggle that they've been engaged in for decades to allow themselves to have access to water, the critical resources that they need to care for those lands. I just think that they're so far ahead of where the rest of these communities need to go.
Clay, thank you so much. Mahalo piha. Full thanks to you
No
for
problem.
spending the time today with us, and for our viewers on this this topic that is critical to get under control.
Yeah, well, I'm just happy to be in a position to hopefully help folks. I didn't really, as I was saying earlier, I didn't know that I was sort of stumbled into this, I feel like, and to sort of be able to contribute you know, to something that's this important for these islands it's a pretty important place to be, so I'm just trying my best.
Great. Well, please keep doing what you're doing. Don't stop. And again, keep up the great work.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us here on Voices of Truth. To our viewers, thank you for joining Clay and me here on the top of Mount Tantalus and learning what we can do to reduce fire risk here in Hawaii. I'm Ehuke Kahu Cardwell for the Kiwani Foundation, along with Clay here. And until next time, ahui ho!
Take care.
Free Hawaii Broadcasting Network.